if you poll a group of like 5 people and ask them for their opinions on like ways to develop in your career, you'll probably get 8 opinions. So don't take the things that I say as just like obviously true on face, right? But weigh them in the context of like the particular of like sort of the particular track that I followed. So for that first question, for my answers to those poll questions, I did a PhD. I did not do a postdoc. I've been at a couple of companies prior to Recursion, ranging in size from about 12 to about 500, 600 people. So I started my PhD inclined to going into industry. In fact, I started like being like, yeah, I'm like 95% sure I'm going to end up going into industry at the end of this. And I think I had a fairly unique experience in my doctorate, both in terms of like getting along really well with my advisor in my lab, but also my advisor being supportive of that idea that like, yeah, like I'm interested in going into industry. And so I got to screw around with a lot of different things during the course of my PhD. So, I think, unlike a lot of people, particularly in, like laboratory-based or biology PhDs, where you really have to like hew really narrowly to one topic, right? And sort of like fail, like 500 times before you kind of got one experiment to like half work and then you can graduate. I got to play around with a lot of different things, and like to the extent that actually my most cited paper coming out of grad school does not appear in my thesis at all. It was just like a side project for funsies that people got excited about because I said that maybe you could use it to detect like North Korean nuclear explosions by looking to see if graphics cards like produced errors. Turns out you probably can't, but like it did lead to Los Alamos putting a computer inside a neutron beam line at a nuclear reactor, so I consider that a win. I knew at the end of that I did not want to do a postdoc, but I was actually, by the end of my PhD, about 50-50, like between going into academia or going into industry. But my decision point was basically like, look, maybe I'd consider a faculty position, but if I have to do a postdoc, I don't want to do that because I see the postdocs next to me and like, that's not the life that I want to live. Those of you who have done postdocs, I think, are probably sympathetic to this to this idea. But so during the at the end of my PhD, I decided that I started doing some applications. I decided I wasn't quite ready for it. I was like, look, all these applications I'm going to keep doing exactly what I'm doing right now, and even I'm not excited by that. So I wanted to explore more broadly, go into industry and, learn a few more things, get a bit more perspective on what were interesting problems. But I did actually structure my industrial career in order to leave or return to academia like as a potential option. So in particular, hewing my career towards like places where I could do interesting sort of applied research problems and actually publish on them. And, as time went on, actually develop research groups and try to set like a more coherent research direction. In terms of what that meant, like I said, I've been at a couple of startups. First place I was at after my PhD, I joined at about 50, 60 people. We grew to somewhere over 550 and then shrank again. Started off essentially as a software engineer working on automation and process control and like workflow for our wet lab, and eventually like got to rise through the ranks there, like, was managing the engineering team and got to actually establish the research division at that company when we had reached sort of a state of stability where we could focus a few people's time on more forward-looking matters. And then after that, at another startup that was about 12 people, joined as chief scientific officer, and basically like rebuilt internal R&D for that company from scratch, right? So, looking at what we had, rebuilding it, and like getting the first published data out there, right? So in both cases, like having this unique mix of experiences of looking at both this sort of like product-driven perspective of like, what are the things that the company needs to do as a business, as well as, maybe not a purely academic forward-looking research perspective, but a little bit more forward-looking. What are the things that we might want to be thinking about, in 5 years' time that could lead to products or could not, and maybe are just interesting? Or, for example, in the case of that first startup, what are unique things that we have that we really ought to be sharing back with the community, right? We had one of the world's largest genetics data sets, and we were able to write papers that literally changed medical guidelines in the United States as a consequence of this data that we had, right? So a combination both of like pure interest as well as like giving back to the community. After I left that that second startup, you know, I took most of a year to try to figure out where I wanted to go, and I actually did consider consider a return to academia, as well as a range of different industrial options, ranging from starting a company from the ground up, all the way up to joining, you know, very large pharma companies. And, you know, I went fairly down the route for all of those, right? For academia, I did applications, I did job talks. I actually had an offer or two that I decided that I didn't want to do. You know, for startups, you know, I was talking to VCs as well as potential co-founders, and I was weighing against options from big pharma as well. So that was sort of a useful experience in understanding what were the things that folks in these different areas were looking for, and the flip side of that, like what does that imply about the value system that they have, right? That the qualities that they actually find interesting or demonstrative of progression in different stages of your career, like setting you up for different kinds of positions. So with that, three main aims that I have for the talk. I'll just write them up here and we'll kind of go through them. The first one is really tailored to the half to 2/3 of folks in the room who are coming from a heavily academic background, right? Like PhD or MD, and plus, right? And it's understanding like the academic versus the industrial value system, right? And we'll talk a little bit as well about like, you know, academics, I think, is a little bit more homogeneous. In industry, there are somewhat different value systems depending on industry and depending on, you know, the particular position that you have, right? Whether you're product focused, whether you're industrial research focused, whether you're commercially focused. Second, to show like how this industrial value system changes as a function of the size of the company, right? So keying into that second or the third question that I polled the audience on. And finally, thinking about career growth and development across different timescales of your career, right? And I'll be honest, the end is a little bit just my soapbox to rant about a couple of things, but that's probably the fun part because like then you can just like troll me with stupid questions. I don't think I understood. Yes. No, in fact, I would say that a postdoc is far more similar to things that you might sometimes find valued at industry in the limit of infinite size. I think that a postdoc is like a company of size 1 is about as far removed from academia as you can possibly get. And we'll talk about that. Cool. So feel free to like interrupt with questions whenever. I noticed there's not a clock on that wall and I left my phone there. And I've got a mic in one hand and like notes and marker in here. But Britt will help me with that. But yeah, like if you have questions, just raise your hand and Britt will like look around and like throw you a mic. Cool. So to kick things off, how many of you have seen the website like Matt Might's Illustrated Guide to a PhD? Couple of people. Those of you who have seen it, like thumbs up, thumbs down. Like, do you agree with like the take on it? Cool. So for the rest of you, I'll draw out the central thesis, and like it's really going to inform like the way that we look at academia versus industry. So the way he describes it is to say, you know, imagine that inside of this circle we have all of human knowledge, right? And you know, you start out with sort of nothing, right? Or maybe you have a little bit of like inborn instinct. And as you progress, you know, through your academic career, right? You know, going up about through your bachelor's, you know, you're kind of getting, you know, a sort of well-rounded education, right? You know, maybe with your bachelor's, you know, it starts bulging out a little bit, right? Like you have a little bit of a specialization. The goal of a PhD is very, very different from what has come in the past. And that's often something that trips people up in the first couple of years of really trying to do research. Where the goal is, you know, in your first couple of years, you know, yeah, you get a little bit of breadth, but honestly, the most important thing is actually like focusing down so that you actually reach all the way out to the boundary of what is known about a very particular field, right? And then as you're going along, like this is a point where everything that you do stops working. Because we're at the place where actually nobody knows exactly how to move to the next step. Your job is to figure out how to move that. And so after several years, you know, if we zoom in on this, right, we've got that boundary of knowledge, and you're sort of like reaching this little like finger of like exploration out. Hopefully after a few years, what happens is you actually make some discovery or you make some breakthrough. And this barrier gives way and it actually starts looking just a little bit like this, right? And now like, you know, your knowledge like extends out to there. And that little shaded bit, that contribution that you've made, that's called a PhD, right? Which feels really depressing when you're in the moment. Because you like, look at this whole thing, you're like, that's good enough. It's also really elating in the moment because you're like, wait, that's all I did and you're gonna let me graduate? Like I am out, right? But the interesting thing is that like in academia, like this expression of the value system, right, does not stop like when you've completed a PhD. If you were to go on and, you know, do a postdoc or continue on and become faculty, the expectation is that you're going to continue pushing that boundary out, right? And, you know, if we're looking at, you know, like the metric that defines whether or not you're doing a good job in academia, right? You know, sort of, you know, if we're measuring, you know, some properties of this shaded region, right, that measures sort of like your knowledge and your contribution, you know, a short way of approximating like what the value function is in academia is what is the maximum radius like at any point over here, right? You don't really care like if you know this just a little bit. It's like, well, how far did you get, right? And in many ways, it's actually better to be really far out along one direction than it is to be like moderately far out on a bunch of different directions. So what that implies is that, you know, there are a few counterexamples to this. In particular, like, you know, you have interdisciplinary fields where, you know, okay, maybe it's actually valuable to know a few different things. But you can think about it as just like a different projection where it's like, okay, well, you know, we could call this interdisciplinary field its own thing. And now, you know, you need to see how far you're coming out, like out of the board along that particular direction. So what that implies about sort of the academic trajectory and sort of the academic now internal value function for how you decide which projects are worth taking on is that you want to take on projects that logically follow from the ones that you've already done, right? Because that's the way that, you know, you sort of like keep pushing out along this exact radius, right? You're looking for maximum radius, not maximum area. And this is something that, you know, I saw really clearly actually when I was doing these faculty interviews, you know, about a year ago now, right? You know, I would go give a talk, you know, it would be about, hey, like, here is a big problem that I see being tackled by everybody in industry or everybody even in like sort of clinical care. Everybody's kind of half-assing it and doing a bad job. This screams out for a direct solution, right? The immediate first question from a committee is, well, have you already been working on exactly that problem for the last 3 years, right? It's not a question of, do you have the skills to try to tackle this? It's, have you demonstrated it on exactly this problem, right? Because it's not just, you know, do you have the capacity to move it out here, but have you already moved it out and you can just continue to build on that? Now, part of that is sort of like the social structure of academia, right? Part of that is the financial structure of academia, which is that if you've already been doing it for a few years, then you've already got some results and you're more likely to get grant funding, and so you can keep building on that, right? But it's interesting to think about how that feeds back in on itself, right? If that's a criteria for grant funding, that you already have results on a particular problem, then that structurally makes it extremely difficult to set up new areas of breadth, right? So that's the academic value function. A lot of folks in here who have that background, like any commentary about like sort of nuance to this, like does this seem broadly correct? Hey, James. Cool. So let's dive into where this goes. This is how it looks. For academics, right? Value equals radius, right? In industry, things generally work differently, and we'll talk a little bit about the nuance of this in the second part of the talk, where we talk a little bit about company size. But the biggest difference here is that this is emphatically not the case in industry, right? Whereas academia rewards being ultra deep in a very narrow particular specialization, in industry, depth for its own sake is really not the thing that matters. And in fact, being skilled in multiple things is often more valued and more valuable than being ultra deep in just one thing. And as we'll talk in the next section, it's hard to find, any one place that cares about an ultra specialization, right? So the trick with being ultra specialized is you're really good at that one thing, but you better find an environment that cares about that one thing. Otherwise, it's just not important at all, right? And I mean, this is true even in academia, right? Where, people will spam out applications to a lot of different departments because your research just may not fit very well at a particular department, so they don't care. Same thing in industry, except even worse. And so, diversification of skills ends up being useful because, you're not being judged just on that one thing, you're being judged on a diversity of skills. And in fact, the value function here, whereas here, we're talking about value in academia being radius, right? Which is literally just how much do you know about anything, right? Just it doesn't matter what the thing is, just something, how deep can you go on that? In industry, it's a little bit different. It's actually that value is more around what can you do, not what do you know, right? In the sense that it's really more around what are the results that you're going to deliver, right? Any company is going to have particular drivers for its success, right? In many cases, these are going to be products that need to be built. These are internal processes. This might be improving efficiency of those things, right? But at the end of the day, at least, here and, in sort of not nonprofit industries, there's going to be a bottom line for the company. And the question is how are you contributing to that, right? What are the things that you can actually do? It's wonderful if you know a lot of things, but if you're not able to apply those and actually generate value, at the end of the day, it's going to be pretty hard to generate a business case for why you ought to be there, why you ought to get that raise, why you ought to get that promotion, right? And so that actually implies some really interesting things around how to think about sort of project choice and the next things to work on when you're in academia versus industry. So remember that in academia, there's a strong self-reinforcing effect where if you've already gone in one direction, you want to keep proceeding along that direction as far as you can, because that's really the driver that's going to determine your success, both in terms of, standing with your department head or with funding agencies. In industry, that's actually very different, right? Let's say that, let's say that we've been working on a system, then we sort of took it up from nothing, right? And now we've gotten it to 95% complete, right? Now, for those of you who read machine learning papers, that, if somebody takes a 95% accurate system and now takes it to 99%, they will say that is amazing. That is actually a 5x reduction in the error rate. And so this is all amazing, right? Because, you had 5% errors, now you only have 1% error. But from the perspective of the people working on the problem, well, actually it worked 95% of the time, now it works 99% of the time, right? That might not actually be that big of a difference. And so the important thing to think about as well, is it actually more valuable to take something that's 95% to 99%, and then take that out to 99%, or is it better to find a completely different problem, which is maybe sitting at 10% and take that to 80%, In academia, sometimes this is rewarded, right? Especially if you can apply a method that you've already shown to be valuable in one domain and show, hey, like it blows things up in this other domain as well, right? And this has all sorts of interesting, you know, applied implications, and therefore DARPA is going to give me money to do something with it. But, you know, more often what we see is people like sticking with one particular method or sticking with one particular problem and really just trying to eke whatever they can out of it. The difference in industry is that like the value function is not like how well can you do on that one problem, it's to what extent are we solving the joint set of problems for the entire business, right? And there are cases where rather than taking a 95% system like all the way to the line, right, where the amount of work may be sort of exponentially increasing with that, it may be better to find a new one where it's a lot easier to make an impact, right? Like the fact that, you know, doing this may literally be 1 week of work, and doing this maybe like 2 years of work, right? Another structural bias in academia is like, this is great, right? Because this means that you can give a PhD student this project and like, you know, this, you know, maybe like forms their thesis, like it ties them up for a while. But, you know, so the fact that, you know, something that only took you a week to solve, like probably isn't going to get you a paper. Like, I don't care. Like that is great. Like that is fantastic. Cause that means that like you could take a bunch of these 10% problems and like push them really forward in a short amount of time. Right. So the fact that something is like, you know, easy or like methodologically trivial is not actually a challenge in industry. Right. There are places where you know, you will want to bring in, you know, the latest, like, you know, crazy thing or the latest advances. But in many cases, that's not going to be the case, right? So another way of putting that is that, you know, whereas academia values novelty for its own sake, right? Because novelty is just another way of like expressing radius over here. In industry, like, you know, there are places where novelty is useful, right? I don't see Kevin in the room, but if he were, he would say, yes, like be novel, then we can file more patents, right? But, you know, often like what you want to do is sequester novelty to very particular areas of what you're doing, right? Because novel almost always means unreliable. Because sort of by definition, nobody has tried it. Nobody knows where all the sharp edges are. Nobody knows about the corner cases where it's going to fall over. And so the question is like, is the additional value that you get from a novel method actually worth investing in that? You have to measure it by, you know, what's delivering value for the business, not purely the radius of the thing that you're working on. Now, one like sort of last thing that I want to say about this, right, is that although like, you know, here, you know, we've said that, you know, academia is radius driven, right? And in industry, like, you know, you want to be able to do more things. It would be a misunderstanding to say that like the industrial value function, you know, academia is about radius and industry is about area, right? Because it could be, and, you know, in deeply technical fields often is the case. And, you know, even if it's not deeply technical, like often, you know, talking about like, you know, particular practices at a given company, there's often the case that like, there's sort of like some threshold of knowledge that you need to have in order to be useful at all, right? And so it's totally possible to be like, yeah, I'm going to like learn a lot of these different things. And like, you know, a lot of things and you're building up a lot of area, but it turns out that like, you're not actually that useful at any of them. Right. And in terms of thinking about like promotions and leveling ladders, right? In many cases, like for any particular domain or any particular discipline, you can imagine that like there are particular radii that you have to reach in that discipline in order to like say like, hey, like, you know, I am now like, you know, a principal level, whatever, right? And if you invest like purely in breadth, you have to consider whether or not you can actually get that. So there are aspects in which radius is important in industry, but again, really it's going to be determined by like, what are the useful things that you're able to do. So before I pivot over to talking about how the shape of this value function like changes as a function of size, like any questions or discussion points like so far?
You have circled industry as like a circle. What I would like to comment that industry is more of a sector, not a circle. So basically, a good example, my master's degree in plasma physics is not very useful in recursion. no matter how much I know about it, right?
That's absolutely right. And so, for example, like, if we were actually drawing, different fields as, like sectors on this circle, right? It might be that, plasma physics is over here, right? And so, recursion's like, definition of what makes you useful is like, yeah, I actually like don't care about that, but I care a lot about like stuff over here. Whereas if you wanted to go to like a nuclear fusion startup, like they would not care about your ability to do medicinal chemistry or cell imaging. And they would like they actually want you to be like out here on plasma physics, right?
You mentioned the academic sort of like the things that it values kind of driving you more toward pursuing a narrow focus as you explore the boundaries of human knowledge. And one thing that I've experienced in industry is like sort of a shadow of that, where the things that the company at which I'm working values sort of drive me to pursue a narrow area of knowledge, but it's not like human knowledge. It's like knowledge about the way that particular company works or that particular project. So I end up with like a really similar looking knowledge profile to the one you've drawn, except for it's not actually, it's like in an alternate universe where nobody cares about it except that company.
That's absolutely true. And I'll actually come back to that at the end of the talk. Like that's a real thing.
I won't hit you.
I found in industry that there's a little bit of the academic thing you described, in that having some credibility is necessary in order to like be trusted in order to expand in that area. Do you have any like tips on what to do about that, or thoughts in general?
Yeah, so I mean, that's absolutely true, right? And that's sort of another variant of what I was describing here, right? You have to get to a certain area before you're useful, or as you're putting it, before you're credible in that particular space, right? And, there are decisions that you have to make, right? About the things around the dimensions around which you want to be credible or not, right? I'll talk a little bit about it at the end in terms of picking and choosing those. But a lot of those are sort of like, either case by case or personal preference driven, right? There are a lot of places where you could try to specialize, and some of it is going to be your preference. Some of it is honestly going to be a little bit of a bet on the future of what do you think is going to be like valuable to be credible in downstream. Cool. So now like 25 or 30 minutes in, like I'm finally going to come back to the question that Renat asked before we kick this off, right? And how does this look as a function of the size of company? I think the biggest the biggest sort of trend here is that you see you see a trade-off of generalization versus specialization as companies grow. And it's a little bit too simple to say that like, small companies value generalists and large companies value specialists. I think what it actually is that in an organization of like any particular size, only a certain percentage of those people can actually be specialists and be useful. So in particular, like let's say that you are a technology-driven startup in the sense of, an innovation-driven startup, right? Where you're trying to do something that's like really close out to that frontier and like, apply that, right? Turn something novel into a real product or into an advance. Chances are there are going to be at least like one or two specialists that you need. Otherwise, like, everybody at the company is going to be trying to like spend their time like getting out to the boundary before they can even understand what it is they need to do, right? That said, like those specialists may not even be employees of the company. They may be like scientific co-founders or advisors or something like that, right? Where you just have somebody to tell you where the boundary is and what you need to attack. Having a ton of those specialists, at a company, like, if you only had 10 people and you had 5 people who are all particularly specialized in this, it might be problematic because those people may be super optimized for doing only that one thing. And at a very small stage, there are a lot of different things that need to be done. So to give you an example from my own experience, when I joined Freenome at 12 people, by title, like I was a C-level exec. I was also the company's systems administrator, and I had to set up like our compute cluster and maintain it and like kick it whenever it fell over, because nobody else knew how to do that. And people like knew enough to like put together some things, but they weren't really working. They weren't really stable. So I had to pick that up, right? you'll often find that, you know, when you have a nascent organization, like people who are, you know, the line between sort of leadership and project definition and project execution are highly blurred, right? It's highly collaborative. People are kind of doing all of those things together. And, you know, there's often a mix between having to define, like, you know, what are the research objectives and the development objectives and the product and the commercial objectives, because there just are not people to handle all of those separate things at the same time. However, as companies grow, like, you do end up getting more specialization, right? So for the engineers in the room, you know, when you're very tiny, you may have like one job description and it's full stack engineer. And it's like, can you both like figure out how to like plug GPUs into their sockets as well as write React code? Cause like, I ain't got someone who can like do all those separate things. As a company matures, like now it's like, well, actually we are trying to hire a software development engineer in test level 2 who specializes like only in dealing with like C++ 20 code, and like any of you who are still working in C99 are heretics and like will not be tolerated. So, you know, the reasoning there is basically like, as the company grows and diversifies, like you have a better sense of exactly what the needs are, and you have the capacity to support, like, yeah, actually I can have one person, 3 people, an entire division that are just doing an extremely narrow thing, right? So, you know, coming back to Renat's question, you know, around like, what is the relationship between a postdoc and a startup? The challenge is that in a postdoc, like there are elements that are similar to being in a startup in that it's in some ways the first like semi-independent, like really research thing that you're having to conduct. You have some support, but you have less support than you've had from advisors and so on in the past. In some cases, you have to secure your own funding. But nevertheless, very often, like, you know, the goal is really just to keep pushing out in this direction, right? You know, the success criterion is I need to get my Cell Nature Science paper, or I need to get my NeurIPS paper, right? It's not like, you know, well, do I know enough to like set up, you know, all of these different systems from scratch, right? Whereas in a startup, like, you know, if you talk to people who are setting up companies, like they're like, well, today I've had to like deal with the lawyers and like spent 3 hours on the phone with the telco to get our phones hooked up. And by the way, like I'm going to spend the afternoon building IKEA furniture, right? So it's like way more diverse than that. So, you know, as companies grow, they can support more of those narrow domains, support more of those specialists. But one thing that's important to remember is that generalists often end up having a broader perspective than just their narrow problem. And so that ends up putting a lot of generalists like along a management track or a leadership track, or sometimes just a senior IC track where they have a lot of that. They become useful repositories of knowledge, right? They know a lot of the history or the context behind particular decisions, and so end up becoming useful because they're nodes in the group of people in the company, right? You know, once again, like the value function here is how useful you are to the organization as a whole, and correlated to that, like how well can you communicate the value that you are providing to the organization as a whole, right? You need to be able to learn context that's outside your domain in many cases to be valuable, right? There are places where being the ultra specialist like can be useful, but like usually you have to bridge into something adjacent to you. And so you have to have that context, but you still have to execute within your core skill set. So we're running a little short on time, so I'm just going to dive into the very last section, and then, you know, we might have time for a question. Yes. So, you know, AJ, like, you know, coming to your question, also coming to the other question around, you know, like how do you pick the things to specialize on? You definitely want to have core skills on which you can draw, right? Something that is admittedly totally personal bias on my part. I think it's extremely valuable to like make those core skills as adaptable as possible, right? Like keeping your optionality open for the future, right? If you have skills that like you can apply to a lot of different problems, that just sort of like diversifies your risk over time, right? Like you may make a bet on like, you know, a particular programming language or a particular experimental technique or a particular field of biology being really important. And if it ends up not being important, like then you're kind of out of luck. If you have some of those fundamentals, like you end up being better placed for the future, right? One interesting like sort of like koan that I'll leave you all to ponder on, right? Let's say that you've been, you know, at a place or doing a thing for 5 years. Do you actually have 5 years of experience? Do you have the same 1 year of experience 5 times? Or have you collected 5 different 1 year of experience, right? Those are all 3 very different configurations for like time that you can spend in a place. I would say that like, if you're in this situation, like that's a situation that you should probably be getting out of in order to grow, because that means like literally you are not growing, you're just like Groundhog Day cycle, right? These are sort of like 2 extremes of like, you know, the generalization specialization theme, right? And this does take a little bit of forethought and design on your terms about what is the way that you want to grow and what is the way that you want to specialize and what do you think is valuable, right? But the danger here is like balancing your specialization to a very specific company, right? You see this a lot actually in people who have stayed inside the same large organization for like 20 years. They've acquired a huge number of skills in terms of like how to navigate the organizational structure of that particular company. Those are 100% completely useless if they leave that company, right? The same can be true of like technologies and so on, but like, you know, even there, like it's a balance of figuring out, well, what can I learn from the particular technologies that I have here? What are the lessons that I could take, you know, either if we were to do it here again, or if I were to build it somewhere else, or if I saw something parallel in another location, right? So look for those opportunities to take sort of bespoke experiences and make them more general. Another thing to think about is sort of a dichotomy between what I'd call academic skills and business skills, right? You know, for technical people, sort of like, you know, often our intellectual rewards come from intellectual activities, right? But, you know, past a certain point, nobody cares like how fancy the algorithm is or like, you know, how like, you know, beautiful the experimental design is. You know, a way that I used to put it in recruiting decks for one of my past companies, like an assay is not a product. And an algorithm is not a company, right? There's a lot of value in learning about the broader context in which industry operates and learning about the business that you're in order to figure out how to take those core technical skills and deliver value outside of those. So, you know, in a technical domain, like, you know, think about diversifying, you know, if you're like sort of a pure mathematician, like learning something about, you know, software engineering. And if you're an engineer, learning about deploy and infrastructure and ops, right? You know, if you're, you know, in a particular hard sciences field, think about learning like the adjacent fields or ways to apply those, right? Learn about product context, right? You know, internal as well as externally facing products, how you collect user requirements and feedback, how you understand if you're actually building anything valuable. And then also think about, you know, what business needs look like, right? This is a big component, especially as people grow up the management ladder, thinking about personnel management, thinking about product management, thinking about finance, right? Like, you know, the paychecks come from somewhere and it's worth thinking about like, you know, like, well, what can you do to actually make sure those come? One of the core value principles at one of the startups that I was at was produce more than you consume, right? Like, do you know like how much you get paid and how much your benefits cost and like how much food you're eating? And like, can you actually show that you're generating at least that much value in the place that you're at, right? If you're not, should you be somewhere else or should you be changing something about yourself? And finally, like this is a rant, right? Just about trends and fads. I'm a total curmudgeon about these. My favorite talk to give like 5 years ago was a talk that I titled "Genomics is not big data." Because like, just like deep learning is like the thing that like every engineer wants to be doing today. Like back then it was like, no, I have to be working on big data systems. Like if you're not using Hadoop, like you're garbage, right? And it turns out like that was not in fact the case, right? And it just took people a little while to like get over like the hype curve. No matter what field you're in, like there's always a hot trend, there's always a hot field, right? I think a useful piece of advice is to take advantage of your environment, right? And also think about what you can return to your environment. So wherever you're at, like what are the skills that you can particularly learn from your colleagues, your managers, your reports, like other people in the organization? What are skills that, you know, you could actually just go home and learn on your own, right? And try to tailor your learning. So like the things that you can learn on your own, you do that. And make sure that you're taking advantage of where you are to learn those other skills that would be hard to pick up by yourself. And in terms of thinking about ones to like take on like during the day, like during your day job, right? What are the ones that are going to deliver value for the people around you, not just for you, right? Thinking about value, not just in terms of the company, but also on a personal level, like how can you help the people around you to like, you know, like actually like work together better, right? And on the ranty bit, like learn durable skills, right? Not just the skill of the day. There are some things that are perennial, right? Like, you know, people talk about math because like math is forever. Communication skills are something that I think are like super undervalued in technical communities. As you can tell, I've done a lot of public speaking and I think it's actually helped me a lot. The ability to give a really good talk or to like communicate something really well in written form will drive you further than like people like I think give value for or understand, right? And those are really useful things to build on. You know, there are things that are transitory. It's worth getting on top of a couple of trends, right? And you know, especially if you think that those have long-term value. But you also see people who like try to build everything like entirely on trends, right? And this often manifests in resumes that are like entirely buzzword driven. And like, you know, beyond like that just being like a really like ugly resume to look at, it also means that like you're putting yourself in a position where you're going to keep having this, right? And as you progress in your career, you're going to keep having 1 year of experience with the next new thing. And you always have to stay on top of that treadmill of like learning what the new fad is without getting like underlying, without getting an underlying understanding of things that can drive this, right? Like I finished my PhD in machine learning, like literally the year before deep learning overturned like how people do feature engineering and computer vision. But by focusing on like underlying concepts and value, like that's still something that I can work with, that I can interface with, right? And the last bit, like, and this is a hard thing. Like if there really is no alignment between your interests and the ways that you want to grow and like, you know, either what's valuable in your environment or what your colleagues can teach you, then consider moving. The first job move that I made, right, going from Council to Freenome, I loved all the people there. My job was great. I was having a great time, but I felt like I wasn't learning anything anymore, right? I'd kind of capped out on what I could learn, and like that was the reason why it was time for me to make that move. And I'm still tight with all the people there, right? Like that's a very respectable and proper thing to do as far as like driving like your own learning and development. So I've gone over a couple of minutes. I'm happy to like take a question or two, but if you all have to go, that's cool too. Chris's question.
Good.
So my question for you is that, like, a lot of people talk about when they go into management that it's like a change in their career. And so my question for you is like, how do you keep applicable, like being an individual contributor and applicable skills while still being management?
Do you like sleep? You shouldn't like sleep. No, I mean, it's a very like, management ends up being a very different working style, right? Because all of a sudden, like it's about having responsibility for more people than your own, and like your value is kind of determined by like how well you're getting the rest of those folks to work, right? At the same time, like in a technical context, like you're unlikely to be an effective manager unless you can like understand and guide like what those folks are doing, right? So it's a really hard balance of like trying to find time to like do enough or like maintain enough context in order to understand that. I wish I had a good answer, but like really it's just like it's really hard work and I struggle with it, right? Like I have to go through and like purge my calendar every so often just to like dig out a couple hours to like play with something. Mike?
So one of the things to like I looked at in like which way to go in management is suddenly this concept of like usually less individual contributor. So I feel like I've had to see myself deciding if I wanted to have more knowledge on like that higher level strategy and like people progressing versus more knowledge on the thing I've been doing so much more of, which is the individual contribution. So my how, like what I do or what I can do suddenly massively switches. And that's been a thing that I've genuinely been trying to tackle is if I wanted to actually make that switch. So.
Awesome. So I thought that point that you made about one of the big differences between academia and industry was the difference between what you can do versus what you can know. And I so they think in academics, particularly when you're trying to grow new skills, it's easy to take a class or a course and use that as validation that now I can do this. But I think in the industrial world, there's much more emphasis on actually having that experience. And so I was wondering if you had any thoughts on what are good ways to learn new skills that you can also prove out, and what are some good mechanisms for doing that?
Depends how big of a gap you're trying to bridge, right? Like if the gap's really large, then it may be that you have to devote time like outside of work in order to pick that up, right? And I think, that's part of the reason why you see like, coding boot camps and stuff springing up, right? It's because like people just don't have an on-road to doing that. If it's a smaller gap to bridge, something that I've found personally useful is identifying a toy problem, like where I'm working, right? Something that, could have value is not the most critical thing, but as a consequence, like, it's not like, there's not like a really hard deadline on it. And whether it succeeds or fails, like if it succeeds, great. If it fails, like nobody's going to die, right? And just using that as a testing ground to like explore, new technologies or new methods of doing stuff, right? Sometimes these things, it's interesting too, that like sometimes the value that you personally get and the value that the organization gets can be extremely different. At one point I decided that I wanted to learn Node.js, and I wrote this little like image paste bin thing in Node.js. And it was like not that large. It was like 150, 200 lines. And at the end, I decided that like the blog post was correct. Node.js is cancer, and I would never use it again. That little image bin, like for various reasons, ended up being like a part of our production workflow for like curating whether variants are pathogenic or not, which was like totally horrifying, right? But like, there are places where like, you can do something like really simple and just like learn enough of a skill to figure out whether it's worth diving deeper, and like, deliver value or not, right? I think it is useful to find something where there is some alignment where like, if it does work, you can be like, yeah, this is actually going to be useful, right? Cool. Thanks, everyone.